My blood pressure spiked the second he walked into the room, and he was the one who noticed it before I did. I'm 24. I live by myself in a converted attic apartment above a laundromat on the north side of town, and until that Thursday afternoon in November I thought I had my whole life figured out. My job at the record shop covered rent. My dog, Waffle, met me at the door every night like I'd been gone a year. Everything was small and steady, and I had decided a long time ago that small and steady was the safest thing a life could be. I'd built that safety on purpose, piece by piece, the way you stack sandbags before a flood you're not sure is coming, until eventually you forget you're bracing for anything at all and just call it normal. But your body keeps its own records. It remembers things you've trained your mind to skip past. And sometimes it takes a total stranger, someone with no stake in your carefully maintained story, to glance at the data and say the quiet part out loud. The walk-in clinic smelled like antiseptic and old carpet. The lights buzzed faintly, the kind of sound you only notice when there's nothing else to listen to. I'd avoided a physical for almost 3 years, and my best friend had finally told me she wasn't going to keep hearing about my mystery exhaustion unless I let a doctor look at me first. She wasn't wrong to push. She just saw the pattern before I let myself see it. So there I was on the exam table in a paper gown that gapped at the back, staring at a poster about the 4 food groups, answering the nurse's questions in the flattest voice I owned. Smoker, no. Drinker, rarely. Exercise, I bike to work. She wrote it down without looking up, and I found myself wondering whether 25 minutes of biking counted as fitness or just counted as not owning a car. She didn't ask. She just told me the doctor would be right in. The doctor who came in wasn't who the door tag said. The tag read Dr. Whitfield. The man who walked in introduced himself as Dr. Theo Calloway, filling in while Whitfield was out on leave. He looked maybe 30, sandy hair, a pen tucked behind one ear that he seemed to have forgotten about. He talked slow, in a way that made my shoulders drop before he'd even touched the stethoscope. I noticed his hands when he picked up my chart, not flipping through it like paperwork but actually reading it like the words belonged to someone who mattered to him before he'd even looked up at my face. I told myself I was just being observant. I always told myself that the exam went normally enough. Heart, lungs, reflexes. He asked about sleep, about appetite, about whether the tiredness I'd mentioned to the nurse had a name beyond tired. I blamed it on a busy season at the shop, which was true, just not the whole truth. The exhaustion had started long before the new vinyl shipments. It was the kind that doesn't come from doing too much, it comes from holding yourself in a shape you're not sure fits anymore. He typed a note, then looked up over his glasses and asked plainly if I'd been carrying a lot of stress lately. It wasn't the question that threw me. It was how he asked it, not like a box on a form, but like he actually wanted the real answer, not the automatic one I gave everybody else. I told him it had been a hard year. He asked what hard meant. I told him I'd left a long relationship in the summer and that living alone again had hit harder than I expected. He nodded, set the tablet down, and looked at me like he was deciding whether to say something that mattered more than a diagnosis. Then he told me my pulse had jumped the moment he walked through the door and hadn't fully settled since. He said it wasn't a red flag medically, just that bodies sometimes know things before the person attached to them does. Then he asked, quieter, if I was actually okay. Not the script version, the real one. I didn't cry, but I came close enough to feel it in my throat. I told him I was working some things out. He said that sounded honest. He finished the exam, ordered routine blood work, and at the door, almost as an afterthought, mentioned the clinic ran a free counseling program, no pressure, just something that had helped other patients work things out a little faster. Then he was gone, and I sat in my car in the parking lot for 15 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. I looked him up that night. Not for any strange reason, just the way you look someone up after they've left a mark on your afternoon and you're trying to understand why. His bio on the clinic site was short: med school out of state, residency in internal medicine, one line about believing that good care starts with actually listening. There was a photo. He was smiling in it, the kind that reaches the eyes, glasses pushed up into his hair exactly like they'd been in the exam room. Something about that detail sat in my chest longer than it should have. I closed the laptop and tried to read. Waffle watched me reread the same page 4 times from his spot on the couch. With the specific patience of a dog who has given up trying to understand humans, I went back 3 weeks later. The blood work had come back clean, a nurse called to confirm it. I told myself I was only going back because the counseling program needed a doctor's referral, which was technically completely true. I sat in the waiting room flipping through a magazine I wasn't reading, beige walls, a muted morning show playing in the corner. When Dr. Calloway stepped into the hallway and saw me, something in his face brightened before he caught himself into something more professional. He used my name like he'd actually remembered it. He said he was glad I'd come back. It was a small sentence. Doctors probably said it all the time. But the pause before he moved to his next patient told me there was a longer version of that sentence we weren't having yet. The counseling program paired me with a therapist named Priya, who kept a row of succulents on her windowsill and never once let a vague answer slide. Within a few sessions, she'd helped me name things I'd been hauling around for years without examining. The relationship I'd stayed in too long because being alone had always felt like proof I was the problem. The version of myself I'd built specifically to be easy for other people to hold, not dishonest, just edited down to the parts that wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. Priya listened without flinching, the way you listen when you already trust the other person knows the answer and is just circling it. I didn't mention Dr. Calloway. Not because it was a secret, I just didn't know what it was yet. It felt like a theory I hadn't tested, the kind of thing that turns real or unreal depending on whether you say it out loud too early. The clinic sat in a part of town I never used to visit, but I started noticing the diner on the corner, the second-hand bookstore 2 doors down. The little plaza with the benches where people ate lunch when the weather allowed it. I started running in the mornings, which was new. Apparently my body had opinions about all those years of stillness. And my route began drifting past the clinic the way routes do when you're lying to yourself about why. I told myself I wasn't slowing down near the side entrance. I was. We actually spoke again at the record shop. He walked in on a Saturday afternoon, flipping through the jazz section, and turned around right as I clocked who he was. Neither of us said anything for a second, that specific freeze of two people recognizing each other somewhere they weren't supposed to exist. He said my name. I said his, then caught myself and called him Dr. Calloway, and he said outside the clinic he was just Theo. He was holding a Coltrane record. I told him it was a good choice. He asked if I worked there. 4 years, I told him. He said that tracked in a way that suggested he'd already started building a small file on me in his head. We ended up walking the aisles together without either of us suggesting it, jazz then soul then the dollar bin in the back that nobody ever touched but somehow made the conversation feel more serious. There was no performance to him, no managing the silence. Just two people looking through records in a room full of records, which should have been nothing and instead became one of the easiest 20 minutes I'd had in a long time. He told me he'd moved here just over a year ago, partly the job, partly to get distance from a hometown where everyone had decided who he was before he turned 12. I asked what kind of space he'd been chasing. He thought about it for a second, the real kind of thinking, not stalling, and said the kind where you can figure out who you are without an audience already holding opinions about it. I rang up his record. He thanked me, headed for the door, then turned back too smoothly to be spontaneous, and asked if I wanted to get coffee. Not doctor and patient, just two people who'd stumbled into an easy conversation twice now. I said yes before any of my usual filters could weigh in. We met that Saturday at the diner near the clinic. He'd gotten there first and already ordered for both of us black coffee because I'd mentioned once offhand in the exam room that I didn't like things too sweet. The fact that he'd filed that away and acted on it did something to my composure. I spent the next 10 minutes pretending hadn't happened. We talked for almost 3 hours. Not about medicine, not really about music either, though it came up the way it does between two people who use art as a shortcut to talking about everything else. He told me about being the youngest of 4, how love in his house was plentiful but attention was rationed, how he'd learned early to keep his inner life mostly to himself because there wasn't always room for it to be seen. He talked about residency, not just the training but what it does to you to sit with people on their worst days and learn to be useful without being a burden. I told him about my own version of that loneliness, being loved loudly by people who never quite saw the actual shape of me. He said he'd come out to his family 2 years ago, that it had gone better than he feared and worse than he'd hoped, which he called probably the most honest outcome most hard things get. I told him I believed that. I told him I was still in the middle of a few honest outcomes of my own. He said the middle was where the real work usually happens anyway. I walked home rattled in the good way, like something locked in place for years had been gently shifted somewhere better. The city looked the same. We kept seeing each other. Not officially dates, not yet, the way things go when two careful people don't want to name something before it's ready to be named. We went to the botanical garden because he had a membership he kept forgetting to use. We stood in front of the orchid house for 20 minutes while he pointed out details I'd have walked past, not telling me what to think, just what he noticed. We wandered through neighborhoods I'd lived near for years without really seeing, the kind of walk with no destination that somehow adds up to something anyway. He had a way of paying attention that made you feel like the most interesting thing in any room, without ever making it feel performed. I dated people before who were present the way a screen is present, bright, close, ultimately just reflecting something back at you. Theo was present the way a room is warm when someone's actually built a fire in it. There was a night in January, sitting on the steps outside the garden after closing, when the city had gone quiet in that late autumn afterwork before the night crowd way. We'd been talking about something small and then we weren't talking at all, and the silence didn't need filling because it was already full. He reached over and touched 2 fingers to the back of my hand, like checking something was real. I turned my hand over. He let it rest there. Neither of us made it bigger than it was. It just felt like the easiest thing I'd done in years. I told Priya about him the following week. She asked how it felt. I said it felt like being readable, like for most of my life I'd been a version of myself that needed translating, and being around him meant I didn't have to translate anymore. She asked if I was trying to talk myself out of it. I said I was trying not to. She asked what the argument against it would even sound like. I said that things this easy had hurt before, that hope this size comes with a matching size of damage if it goes wrong. She let that sit, then asked, quietly, whether avoiding it all this time had actually protected me from pain or just traded it for a duller, longer version of the same thing. I didn't answer that day. I thought about it the whole drive home and most of the evening with Waffle asleep against my leg, and by the time I went to bed, I knew she was right. The months after that were full in a way I hadn't planned for. Dinners in his kitchen where he cooked slowly and explained every step like the process itself mattered. Mornings walking Waffle along the river, who had hated every person I'd ever introduced him to and immediately climbed into Theo's lap the first time they met. I chose to read that as evidence. Long nights with records playing low, the kind of quiet that's really just company in a different form. And the occasional real argument, the kind that happens when two people are actually trying to build something and keep bumping into each other's old wiring. He had a habit of intellectualizing his feelings until they were technically described but emotionally unreachable, talking about himself like a case study instead of a person. I recognized it because I did my own version, going silent and assuming any friction meant something was structurally broken. We were both still learning. That's the difference between something real and something easy. There was a night in March after dinner with some of his coworkers where I felt, for the first time, completely outside our relationship, like a plus one in someone else's life. I didn't say anything in the moment. I went quiet, my old reflex, he noticed. Asked if I was okay. I said fine, which was the least true thing I'd told him in months. Back at his place, he sat across from me and said plainly that he could tell something was wrong and wanted to understand it if I'd let him. So I told him, not gracefully but honestly, about feeling sidelined, about the old fear under it, about how certain rooms made me shrink back into an edited version of myself. He didn't get defensive. He said he hadn't seen what I described, but he believed it had been real for me, and that belief was something I hadn't known I was starving for. His family came to visit that spring. His mother was sharp-eyed and direct, sized me up in the first 10 minutes, asked what I did for work and nodded like she was filing the answer rather than just hearing it. His father was quieter, the kind of warmth that shows up in small gestures instead of words. His older sister treated me like we'd known each other for years within the first hour. By the end of the weekend, I'd been folded into the family's orbit completely. Theo told me afterward his mother liked me, that she didn't say that about just anyone. She'd told him I had kind eyes and paid attention to her son the right way. I thought about that phrase for days, paying attention the right way. I thought about all the years I'd spent paying attention to the wrong things, to the version of me that was convenient instead of true, to relationships that were possible instead of necessary. I thought about a Thursday afternoon in November when a doctor with a pen behind his ear asked if I was okay, and how much that one question had cracked open without my permission. There's a particular kind of love that finds you only once you've stopped performing for an audience. It's quieter than the kind built on being chaste or being mysterious. It doesn't run on the electric charge of being almost understood, but it is something better, the feeling of actually being known, not the curated version. The real one, still figuring itself out, still getting things wrong sometimes. That kind of love doesn't announce itself. It shows up like early morning light, plain, low, and warmer than you expected. Sometimes it looks like a coffee order remembered from one offhand sentence. Sometimes it's a hand resting in yours on cold stone steps. Sometimes it's a conversation in a record shop that runs 20 minutes longer than either of you meant it to. I think about that exam room sometimes. The paper gown, the food group's poster, how close I came to canceling that morning. I think about what Theo said, that the body knows things before the mind agrees to catch up. He was right in ways that went way past blood pressure. My pulse spiked the second he walked in. That wasn't a symptom, that was information. My body recognized someone who was going to matter before I had a single reason to believe it. I'm 25 now. I live in a bigger apartment with Waffle and a record collection that's slowly being reorganized by Theo's filing system, which makes no sense to me on paper, and somehow works perfectly in practice, which tracks for a lot of things about him. The apartment finally feels like it holds two people without either of us disappearing into the other, which might be the only version of living together that actually lasts. His glasses end up on the kitchen counter more nights than not. I've quietly become the person who remembers where they are. It costs nothing and somehow means everything. I still see Priya every other week. I still run past the clinic some mornings, and some mornings there's a coffee waiting on the front steps that nobody ever officially decided to start doing. He still forgets his glasses are pushed up on his head. I still notice every time. I don't know everything that comes next. That used to scare me more than almost anything. Now it mostly just feels like what happens when you're actually present for your own life, when you stop building walls against the unexpected and start trusting you can handle it when it shows up anyway. I'm not the same person I was that Thursday in November. Nobody changed me. I just finally had the conversation with myself that I'd been avoiding, and it turned out the conditions for having it included a doctor I never saw coming, and a question I needed someone else to ask before I knew how to answer it. The checkup was supposed to be routine. I walked in thinking nothing was wrong. I walked out knowing something had finally, quietly started to begin.